Chapter 18. The Salt Monopoly: Politics, Taxes, and Economy. 1. The East India Company: Struggles of the Bengal Monopoly. In history, few institutions wielded salt as a political weapon like the British East India Company. By the late 1700s, the company had established the Bengal salt monopoly. They transformed a basic human necessity into the primary engine of colonial revenue. Under this system, native salt workers were forced to produce salt exclusively for the company at fixed, low prices. Then the company resold it to the Indian people at massive markups. This wasn't just a commercial venture, it was a sovereign claim over the very chemistry of the Indian body. The struggle of the Bengal monopoly was one of complexity and moral friction. The company faced constant illegal production along the vast, marshy coastlines. To protect its revenue, the British established elaborate internal customs lines. They created a specialized salt police to hunt down smugglers. But the high price of company salt led to widespread suffering. While the company's coffers swelled, the local population was forced to consume earth salt or adulterated brine. This led to outbreaks of salt depletion fatigue and parasitic infections, the very health problems we discussed earlier in this book. By the mid-1800s, the Bengal monopoly became a focal point for reformers, both in India and in the British Parliament. Critics argued that taxing a mineral essential for survival in a tropical climate was a tax on life itself. The company struggled to balance the need for revenue with growing unrest and with rising competition from cheaper imported salt from Liverpool. The Bengal salt monopoly proved something important. When a government seizes control of the mineral of life, it takes on a burden that transcends simple economics. It was a political experiment showing the limits of monopoly power. When faced with the biological imperatives of a nation, monopoly cannot hold. The sensory reality of the Bengal monopoly was stark. Vast, sun-bleached salt pans guarded by armed sentries, while just beyond the fence, a population struggled to afford a handful of white crystals. This chapter of colonial history serves as a reminder. Salt is the ultimate political mineral. In Bengal, the struggle over salt was the first tremor of a movement that would eventually challenge the foundations of the British Empire itself. 2. Smuggling on the frontier, from the Adriatic to Russia. Whenever a government imposes a high tariff on a vital necessity, a shadow empire rises. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the frontiers of Europe were defined not just by language or crown, but by the clandestine movement of salt runners. From the jagged coastlines of the Adriatic to the vast frozen steppes of Russia, salt smuggling became a sophisticated underground industry. In regions where the salt tax made the mineral more expensive than gold, the smuggler became a folk hero, risking the gallows to bring white gold to the common man. In the Adriatic Sea, Venetian and later Austrian monopolies created thriving illicit trade between coastal salt pans of Istria and mountain villages of the Balkans. Smugglers used small, fast boats to dart between islands under cover of night, avoiding the heavy galleys of the salt guard. Once on land, salt was packed into specialized leather bags designed to be silent and waterproof, carried by mule trains across hidden alpine trails. In Russia, salt smuggling across the borders of Poland and Prussia became so rampant that the Tsarist government was forced to militarize its customs frontier, leading to violent skirmishes that felt more like small-scale wars than police actions. The ingenuity of smugglers was legendary. Some hid salt in double bottoms of wine barrels. Others dressed as pilgrims, concealing bags of salt beneath heavy robes. In the French borderlands, specialized salt dogs were trained to carry small packs of salt across the frontier and return home alone, exploiting the fact that guards were less likely to shoot a stray animal. This underground economy created a parallel social structure with its own codes of honor and secret languages. It proved that the biological salt hunger of a population is stronger than any legislative decree.
The sensory reality of the salt frontier was one of whispered deals in darkened taverns, the cold, metallic scent of salt air in a mountain pass. Smuggling on the frontier demonstrated that salt is a fluid commodity. It cannot be contained by walls or taxes. As long as there was a disparity in price, there was a salt road carved through the wilderness, proving that the common man would always find a way to secure the mineral that maintained his life and preserved his food.
4. The burden of the poor. Salt as a tax on life. In the grand halls of Parliament and the ledgers of kings, salt was viewed as the perfect tax, a commodity with inelastic demand. Every soul, from duke to beggar, was forced to buy it. However, on the dirt floors of the peasant's cottage, the salt tax was experienced differently, as a tax on life itself. Because the poor subsisted almost entirely on vegetable matter and coarse grains, they needed significant salt for digestion. They were biologically forced to pay a higher percentage of their income toward the tax than the wealthy, who could afford meat and diverse nutrients. This economic disparity created a physiological crisis of poverty. In 18th century France, a laborer might spend up to a month's wages just to secure enough salt to preserve a single pig for winter. When the tax became too high, families were forced to choose between the salt and the food itself. This led to widespread decline in public health. Without salt, the poor suffered from stomachic languor, an inability to properly break down their high-fiber diets, leading to malnutrition and susceptibility to parasitic worms. The salt tax was, in essence, a metabolic gatekeeper, keeping the lower classes in a state of perpetual physical and economic weakness. The social bitterness caused by this burden was the fuel for revolution. In many cultures, the tax collector who weighed the salt was more feared than the soldier who carried the sword. The salt tax did not just take money, it took the zest from the food and the strength from the worker. By turning a biological necessity into a luxury, the state effectively taxed the blood of its people. This chapter of social history proves that while salt taxes were an easy source of revenue for the state, they were a heavy weight on collective health. The true cost of a salt tax is measured not in coin, but in the vitality of the population. The sensory reality of this burden was the taste of ash, the bland, uninspiring meals of the salt-starved poor. It serves as a reminder, the salt of the earth are also the ones most vulnerable to the whims of the taxman. The history of the salt tax is a history of the struggle for the right to remain healthy, proving that salt is the most fundamental of all human rights.
4. National bankruptcies, wars, and the escalation of prices. Throughout history, salt has served as the ultimate emergency war fund. Because every citizen must consume it, governments viewed the salt tax as a tap that could be turned during times of national crisis to fund grand military campaigns. However, this reliance on salt revenue often became a trap. During long conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars or the American Civil War, the escalation of salt prices to fund the machinery of death often led to the internal collapse of the state. Salt, intended to save the treasury, frequently became the catalyst for national bankruptcy. The escalation cycle was brutal. As a war drained the national coffers, the government would hike the salt tax to pay for ammunition and soldiers. This, in turn, drove the market price of salt to astronomical levels. In the American Confederacy, salt became so scarce and expensive that the government had to seize private salt works. They issued salt rations just to prevent the Army's meat supplies from rotting. When the price of salt exceeds the reach of the common citizen, the economy deforms. Bartering replaces currency. The salt standard emerges. An empire that cannot provide salt to its people is an empire that has lost its internal cohesion. In France, heavy reliance on the cabal to fund the extravagances of the monarchy and the costs of foreign wars created a financial hollow point. When the state could no longer squeeze more revenue from the salt-starved peasantry, the credit of the nation collapsed. The salt tax was a rigid revenue stream. It could not expand indefinitely. Once the breaking point was reached, the state faced bankruptcy.
not just in coin, but in the trust of its subjects. The salt-war connection demonstrates that while salt can fund a war, the social and economic cost of doing so often leaves the nation more bankrupt than at the start. The sensory reality of this economic ruin was the weight of the empty shaker. When salt becomes a war luxury, the foundations of domestic life crumble. This chapter of economic history proves that salt is a volatile political asset. It is the crystalline foundation of a nation's wealth, but when used as a weapon of war finance, it can shatter the very state it was meant to preserve.
5. The parliamentary committees. Advocacy for change. By the mid-1800s, the era of the great salt monopolies began to face its most formidable enemy, the parliamentary committee. As the principles of free trade and the burgeoning science of public health began to influence government policy, a new wave of advocates descended upon the halls of power. Scientists, physicians, and social reformers, all demanding the abolition of salt taxes. These committees became the stage of a dramatic clash between the revenue men, who saw salt as a cash cow, and the reformers, who saw it as a human right. The testimony presented to these committees was often shocking. Physicians provided evidence of the stunting of children in salt-taxed districts. Agricultural experts argued that the high cost of salt was preventing the modernization of farming. One of the most famous advocates for change was John Christian Curwen, an English member of Parliament who fought tirelessly for the repeal of the salt duties. He argued that removing the tax would unleash a mineral revolution, boosting everything from the health of the poor to the quality of British livestock. The victory of these committees was a turning point for modern civilization. Between 1823 and 1825, the British salt duties were finally abolished, sparking a chain reaction across Europe and its colonies. The repeal was not just an economic victory, it was a recognition of biological sovereignty. It acknowledged that the state had no right to profit from the basic physiological needs of the human body. The parliamentary committees proved that advocacy, grounded in science and empathy, could dismantle even the most entrenched monopolies, ensuring that salt would finally return to its rightful place as the universal condiment, free and accessible to all. This was more than just tax reform. It was a fundamental shift in how governments viewed their relationship with citizens, the recognition that some things are too essential to be taxed, too vital to be monopolized, too necessary to be restricted. Salt had been a source of revenue for governments since ancient times, but by the 19th century, the tide was turning. Public health advocates, economic reformers, and moral philosophers all converged on the same conclusion. Taxing salt was not just bad policy, it was an offense against human dignity. The abolition of salt taxes represents one of the great triumphs of advocacy, of speaking truth to power, of using evidence and reason to challenge entrenched interests. The committees that fought for this change understood something fundamental, that the health of a nation depends on the health of its poorest citizens, and that health, in turn, depends on access to essential nutrients, like salt. The legacy of these parliamentary committees lives on in modern concepts of food security, in debates about access to essential medicines, in discussions about what rights are truly fundamental. The fight over salt taxes was, in many ways, the beginning of the modern human rights movement, the recognition that certain necessities transcend economics, that some things belong to all people by virtue of their humanity.